Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu.
Shalom. This episode is about the question of prayer. What is prayer? Is it just some kind of childish, primitive idea that we can get what we want? Or is there some deeper transformative element about it? Enjoy. There is a wonderful story about the Hasidic Rabbi Chaim of Zanz, that he was sitting home one day by the window and he was watching passerbyers. And at one point he knocked on the window and he got somebody's attention. And the person looked up. What is this? He opens the window and he invites him into his house. Come in. I want to talk to you. I want to ask you something. Maybe not something that you would do nowadays, but in the shtetl, that was an okay thing to do. The fellow comes into the house and he says, "Listen, I want to ask you a question. Just try to answer as honestly as you can. If you were to find somebody's purse or wallet on the ground and you found a lot of ducats in there, what would you do? Would you return it to their rightful owner?" And the person said, "Well, Rabbi, if I knew who it belonged to, of course I would return it right away. And if I didn't know who it belonged to, I would try to figure out who it belonged to and return them the money." And the rabbi said, "You're a fool. Goodbye." He walks out. The rabbi goes back to his window. People are walking by. He raps on the window again. He opens his window. He says, "Come here, I want to ask you a question." Person comes in, he puts the same question to him. If you're walking along and you find somebody's money on the street, what are you going to do? And the person says, "Well, what am I, a fool? Of course I'm going to keep the money. It came to me by divine providence, That money is mine if I found it." The rabbi says, "You are not a good person. Goodbye." Now, this is such a great story because probably you're wondering, well, what's the other answer, right? So he does it again. He's asking people or he sees someone go by, he raps on the window, he asks this person to come in, he puts the same question to them. "What are you going to do if you find the money?" And the person says, "Rabbi, how can I know what I'm going to do? Because I don't know what spiritual rung I'm going to be on in that moment. Perhaps if I'm on a higher rung, if I'm particularly conscious that day and I'm aware of myself, then I'm going to try to give it back to the person. But if I'm on a low rung, then probably I'm going to appropriate it for my own use. And furthermore, regardless of which rung that I happen to be on in the moment, how am I to know whether HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to help me to overcome my Yetzer Hara and become conscious and rise above that and do the right thing, or if I don't receive Hashem's help in that moment?" And the rabbi put his hands on his shoulders and he said, "You, my friend, are a sage." So I love this story. It's easy to misunderstand the story, though, because if we understand that we are praising the last person who doesn't know what they're going to do because they don't know what rung they're going to be on, they don't know if they're going to receive God's help, we could understand that as being disempowering, like the person doesn't have any responsibility for their own deeds. It's all based on something external to them. And indeed, we can think that way. Like we certainly can shirk responsibility, and we all know when people do that, or maybe we ourselves do that sometimes, and that's not such a great thing to do, to say, "Oh, it's not my fault. What could I do? Such and such happened. I had to act that way," referring to acting in not such a good way, as opposed to taking responsibility. So if we take the story that way, it's not such a useful story. But there's a beautiful spiritual paradox, and I talk about the paradox a lot that comes in spiritual teachings, which is that if we truly make ourselves receptive to the divine blessing of being more conscious, how the way he says it in the story is, I don't know if Hashem is going to help me or not. So we can think of it in that anthropomorphic kind of personal way. Or we can think of it in a different way as, will the flow of reality support my consciousness in that moment? We can use any words. It doesn't really matter how we frame it, because the essence of it has to do with whether we are aware in the moment that our state of consciousness is not something we can totally control, but we can open ourselves to the support of the greater reality to help us to be more conscious. Because when we do that, we're actually doing both sides of the equation at the same time. We're speaking as if it's not my responsibility, but in doing so, we're taking responsibility because speaking that way actually opens us to that support. When we recognize that it's a blessing and a gift to be in touch with our higher selves, or in touch with our deeper nature, or in touch with our deeper wisdom, however we want to put it, if we understand that that's a blessing that comes to us, then that recognition in that moment helps us to be more conscious. And that's the paradox of the whole thing, which is so beautiful. This paradox of, on one hand, taking responsibility for bringing forth the highest level of wisdom and consciousness that we can in the moment, and on the other hand, doing that by recognizing that we can't bring forth the highest level of consciousness and wisdom within ourselves, but that it's something that has to come to us as a gift. This paradoxical teaching is embodied by the two different Hebrew letters, Gimel and Dalet. So Gimel has to do with our inherent greatness. The word Gimel begins the word Gadol. Gadol Hashem umahulal ma'od. The greatness of the divine, and recognizing that greatness is inherent in our being on the deepest level. It's who we are. It's literally who we are on the deepest level. And so the Gimel in Kabbalah is sometimes pictured through the metaphor of the wealthy person running after the poor person to give them, because they are so abundant, so overflowing that they are impelled to give. And the letter Dalet represents the poor person who needs to receive, who doesn't have anything of their own. It also is represented by the moon, because the moon is a shining heavenly body, but it doesn't give off its own light. It's reflecting the light of the sun and so on. It's receiving. And so that attitude of the Dalet of receiving, of humility, of recognizing that what we have, what we are, comes from beyond us, and the attitude of the Gimel that we are full and abundant and radiant, and we have all this wisdom and consciousness inherent in who we are, those two things are both true on different levels, and they have to actually work together, because we don't want to recognize our own greatness and then make an ego out of it. Claim it for our own and wear it as a badge. That just starts creating ego, which is another way of saying that that attitude itself blocks the wisdom and blocks the consciousness, if we claim it as our own. But if we take an attitude of humility and recognize that it's coming to us as a gift, it's not because I'm so great, it's because of the greatness that is given somehow, however we want to narrate that to ourselves. That opens us, that softens the heart and opens us to receiving. Another way that this paradox manifests is in the idea of the divine itself, right? Because the idea of the divine in esoteric Judaism, in the inner or Nistar streams of not just Judaism, but all the traditions, is that God or the divine is not a separate entity, but is reality itself, is being itself. And so that's a paradox in the sense of receiving, because we already are not separate from that which we are receiving from. Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz had a wonderful teaching on this. He said that when a person prays, they should recognize that the prayer itself is God. That it's not just that they're praying to God, it's that the prayer itself is God. And the one who is praying is itself not separate from God. There's nothing that's separate from God. So when a person thinks of God as separate, then they're like a servant coming before a king asking for something. But when a person recognizes that the prayer itself is God and that everything is God, that's more like a child coming to the parent and the parent saying, oh, just go into my storehouses and take whatever you want. It's yours. You're my child. So the prayer leads to just receiving what you want from the parent. Now, again, there's a way to take this story the right way, and there's a way to take the story the wrong way. If we understand that thinking everything is God means we can just get whatever we want, then we're not taking it in the right way. Obviously, that's going to lead to disappointment. The point isn't object of desire that we are attempting to achieve or receive through the prayer. The point is the attitude of the receiving. So if we recognize that the divine is not something remote or separate from us, but is something inherent in the very words we're saying, in the very consciousness that's hearing the words, in this very body that is the temple, the dwelling place for the consciousness that we are, if we recognize that all of this is the divine, then when we receive things, we can receive them in an intimate way, in a way that is like a child receiving something from a parent. So this is something that we can practice, and it's wonderful to practice this all day long, moment to moment. You know, in Judaism, we have the practice of making blessings. So there are traditional blessings before you eat, after you use the bathroom, when you put on your clothes in the morning, all kinds of blessings that go throughout the day, plus all the blessings that are in the traditional tefillot, the prayers that happen 3 times a day and before you go to bed and so on. And those are wonderful ways of training ourselves to live in a way that we might call prayerful. To live in a prayerful way. What does that mean, prayerful? It means that whatever's happening in our experience, whether we're receiving something or we're doing something, that there's a sense of openness and relationality to what we're doing. There's a sense of open-heartedness. There's a recognition of what we're receiving. Those brachot, that practice of blessing, can help us come into that prayerful state, but we don't have to limit it to that. We don't have to say, okay, just when I say the blessing, I'm going to become prayerful, and then go back to a more normative, ordinary way of doing things. Again and again, all day long, everything we're doing, we can become aware of the blessing. When we get up and we walk into a different room and we reach out our hand and we grab the doorknob and we turn the doorknob, we can become aware that this is a blessing, that this arm, that this appendage of our body is working in this moment to turn the doorknob, to transport our bodies into the next room. With my door here in this office, I give that example because the doorknob was broken recently. So I was aware that it wasn't working. It was not really opening very well, and it wasn't really shutting, so I had to get a screwdriver. But when things don't work, sometimes it calls our attention to something that we take for granted. But again, we don't have to wait for things not to work. We don't have to wait for saying the blessing. We don't have to wait for any of those things. We can bring our awareness to what's happening in our lives moment to moment in a prayerful way. And this is a kind of training of ourselves to be prayerful in what we're doing. The actual traditional prayers can be a help to that if we use it in that way. But again, we don't have to wait for it. It's in our capacity to adopt that prayerfulness in whatever we're doing. And the benefit of that, besides just the sweetness of the prayerfulness itself, I mean, it's a benefit in and of itself to have that attitude of prayerfulness. But the other benefit, if we want to step back and look at it in the context of the spiritual process, is that it helps us to not get caught in identification with our own self-centered thoughts and feelings, which another way of saying that is it helps us to not generate coarse ego structure within ourselves. Instead, it helps us to remain open and free from that ego so that, and this is the whole point of all this practice, so that we can live from our essence, so that we can live from those spiritual qualities which are already inherent in our nature, which we name through the 32 paths of presence. So 2 of those qualities are the ones we just talked about. Dalet, which is receptivity, awareness of the blessing and the gifts that are coming to us and constantly giving to us moment to moment. And Gimel, which is the awareness of that feeling of completeness, that feeling of wholeness. On the level of time and activity, we're usually dealing with things that are incomplete. Every breath we take is motivated by that feeling of incompleteness. We need to take the next breath. But on the level of consciousness, the background against which all of our experience of movement in time, incompleteness, and fulfilling that incompleteness, as that happens over time, and that's our experience in time, the background of that is the sense of the field of consciousness within which it's all happening. And that has a sense of wholeness and completeness to it. And what we want to do with this practice, with meditation and all of the other practices of prayer and chanting and movement and so on that go along with it, is it's all ultimately about helping us to be more and more established in that wholeness, so that as we live and interact in the world of time, it's like the breath of God coming into the world. It's like heaven coming down to earth. When a human being lives with that sweetness, with that sense of wholeness, with that sense of restfulness in the moment, as opposed to neuroses, anxiety, different things that arise naturally in this life of time, that's a way of healing not only ourselves, but really healing the world and healing those around us too. And so this practice of prayerfulness is so vital to bring to this body, this person, but also to bring to the world. I hope you enjoyed this episode on the power of prayer. If you liked the video, then be sure to like the video on YouTube and leave us a comment. We'd love to hear from you. And if you'd like to put this into practice and go deeper with it, you are welcome to meditate and learn with us live in community on Zoom. Just go to torahofawakening.com and you can try membership free. All blessings.